There is nothing wrong with your radio.
Do not attempt to adjust the volume.
We are controlling the broadcast.
For the next hour we will control all that you hear.
You are about to experience the knowledge and insights of the media mothership.
All right. That was Desire Line. No, that was Deer Hunter with Desired Lines. Great band. And this is now Media Tackle with Craig Norris, PhD. And I'm joined on today's show by two really special guests. It's been a great pleasure to have both you guys on. Travis Deverell, a.k.a. Shirtaloon?
Yes.
Shirtaloon?
Yes.
Say that kind of non-confidently. It's an interesting name, which I'd like to get around to. Well known to those who read kind of web novels from his book, He Who Fights with Monsters, or serialized fiction, maybe. I guess book is a bit too narrow to define this huge epoch-spanning thing that we'll be talking about. And joined by Peter Wills, writing assistant. How are you, Peter?
I'm fine, thank you.
I'll get you a bit closer to the mic.
I'm fine, thank you.
Yes, no, you are. And what we're going to do is discuss, I guess, some of the background around the type of writing you do. I mean, most people understand when people labeled a writer that it means, okay, they write stuff. And within writing, I guess we would define what you do, Travis, as fiction writing.
Yes, serialized fiction.
But that might be the extent of understanding many lay people might have to understanding the particular, very, very contemporary genre of writing you're doing. In fact, when I was looking it up, so as I mentioned, you've been writing this very long serialized fiction on a number of web novel fanfic sites that it's hosted on, Royal Road, Scribble Hub, and within those sites they define the genre that you're writing within as action, adventure, fantasy, and I think those three so far I'm getting the clues of what it is. And I've read the first 9 chapters and I'm thinking, a lot of action, you've got a protagonist and he's fighting things. But then there were 2 other terms which I want to spend a bit of time explaining, which is LitRPG and Isekai. But before we go into kind of unpacking that world of really kind of new emerging genres, what is He Who Fights with Monsters all about? Let's talk a little bit about defining this magnum opus.
Okay, well, it digs into the 2 things you were talking about, LitRPG and Isekai. So LitRPG is from literary role-playing game. It's the idea of a story, a written story, in which video game elements appear within the universe of the story. So in addition to traditional fantasy elements like magic, dragons, etc., there's also this aspect of a video game interface, like screens that pop up and you've got character stats just like in a video game. And that's more or less a starting point for LitRPG. And
we were chatting a little bit before we came on air about examples that people probably or possibly have seen in movies. And the one which came to my mind, which must be the most standard one now, is the Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle movie, where you have... The one I remember is like you've got The Rock and Kevin Hart. Yeah. Is that the sequel to that one? Anyway, and they've landed...
The Rock, Kevin Hart, Karen Gillan, and... I forget who
Jack Black.
Jack Black, that's right, yeah, how could it be Jack Black? Yeah. And they get sucked into the video game, and they're in the video game, and then the thing which this movie does, which is really akin to LitRPG, as you were explaining it, was... You'll see pop-ups. You'll actually see the mechanics of the video game in the movie recognized by the characters. They'll say, oh my god, I've got character stats screen in front of me.
Yeah. LitRPG is very much in that vein, except it's obviously the written word. It also tends to incorporate those elements a lot more heavily and more in depth. It depends. A lot of them are based off classic... modern multiplayer role-playing games. So you'll have, a character. That character will have a class. That class will have certain abilities. That class, and you'll go up in levels as you go. And so the characters will do so.
So lit RPG involves both that word literature. So it's literature that you're writing as well as being read in terms of it's all text. You've got paragraphs and dialogue being spoken. And then I know in yours the font will change and the layout will change in a way that you realize this is the pop-up screen that's being shown.
Yeah, well, that's one of the advantages of working in a purely digital medium. My story appears online, as do most stories of my type. They quite often sort of migrate into ebooks and the like. But the digital format gives you a freedom to play around with fonts and text and formatting, so you can have a character sheet with boxes for stats and all that sort of thing that is a lot less practical with traditional publishing.
So how big is this? I mean, given that many people probably have only come across it in that really recent film, Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, would that be the best example in cinema of it? Are there any other examples where...
I can only think of one. It's a movie called Gamer, which isn't quite the same, but it keeps a core element in that somebody is actually controlling a felon, as in the moves he makes on the keyboard with the interface are what that person needs to do in real life, which doesn't have so much pop-up text and boxes, but it integrates the game with the real world, which is a bit better, I think, in talking what Travis's story does, because his main character isn't playing a game and gets to log off and go home. His main character got sent to another world, so he's living his real life. And he had specific reasons for doing it that way, which I'm sure he'll get to. And
and what's interesting about the LitRPG genre is, so you get transported to another world, and obviously Alice in Wonderland style, right? So that convention exists, quite old. But here in LitRPG, the character recognizes that they're in a game because of the conventions that surround them.
LitRPG can be a literal game, and quite often it is. If you want the most contemporary cinematic example, that would be Ready Player One.
And that would be LitRPG as well?
It's... I don't know that I'd really call it strictly LitRPG, but it has those elements because there's that element of going into the game and dealing with interfaces and so on, which is... Because LitRPG is generally divided into two elements. Or two sort of categories, which is one where it's a literal game. Like, the characters are playing a game. They may be locked into that game and unable to escape, a la Sword Art Online.
Or, what's that new Rhine?
Free Guy.
Free Guy,
yeah.
Yes.
Except I believe he's actually a digital character in the game.
But he becomes conscious, I guess.
But, there's the ones that are in a game. Sometimes it's like what they call a death game, where people are locked in and you can't leave until certain conditions are cleared or whatever. And sometimes it's more of a slice-of-life thing about people who spend a lot of time in games, and that's sort of the social element they're exploring. And then you've got people who are thrown into an actual... generally a fantasy universe, and that might be they were playing a game and they get thrown into a universe that is like that game, or they could be like mine where they're thrown into an actual fantasy universe and for whatever reason there are video game aspects.
So Jumanji would be in that second category, people thrown into a game through a portal. Kind of.
Yeah, because they are actually they are taken out of their reality and put into another.
And obviously one of the problems with all genres is the defining of it is problematic. I mean, even stuff like horror genre, there's books and books written and online flame wars about what is and isn't horror. And so obviously it's limited.
Yeah, it's the same with LitRPG. Some people will say if it's not actually set inside a game, it's not really LitRPG. Other people will say no, if it's actually inside a game, that's game lit, and it goes on and on and on.
They start throwing around words like, if there's not diegetic elements of, then...
Because we were talking whether Tron is kind of lit RPG or not, and feeling like it's really not.
No.
And Tron's not lit RPG, because even though it involves someone going into a game world, within that game space...
Yeah, as soon as he gets into the world, that's his world. There's no game messages, there's no system interface, there's nothing to tell him he's in a game. I suppose that's one of the defining features, the fact that the main character or the perspective character knows they're in something with an interface.
And I think it's... the thing with Tron, as I was saying earlier, is I really think the difference is thematic. Because with Tron, they're trying to make the artificial human, whereas LitRPG is about taking... traditional fantasy and adding that element of artificiality that comes from video game interfaces, as well as being a very handy tool for creating conceptual shortcuts for readers. So there's so much fantasy and so many videos, all this stuff around now, that you can very quickly and concisely introduce concepts just by explaining them in video game terms.
He's a fighter. He's a mage. She's a priest.
So yes, in the book you're developing, the main character realizes that they're becoming a type of character, or that they're given prompts to start defining themselves as a character.
Basically, it starts off with my protagonist waking up. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know how he got there. But he immediately starts encountering this video game interface. So his immediate thought is this holograms or something? Because, he comes from a grounded real reality. He's a person with a skeptical mind. So he tends to analyse these sort of fantastical elements and discern a reason behind them. And so he only sort of slowly has to come to the realisation that this seemingly impossible thing is actually happening.
So that's the convention of lit RPG. How big is this space? I mean, you were mentioning its links to Korea. I mean, what's its history in terms of where did it come from? How long has it been ticking over? In the form we'd recognise it in today on websites like Royal Road.
Okay, so...
Well, can I get you to be closer to the mic?
Sorry. Okay, as best I understand it, and I'm no comprehensive historian of this particular format or genre, but serialized fiction, as it currently exists as a popular mode of written storytelling, largely originated in Asia. This is China, Korea, Japan, as a lot of stories were put online. And they were delving into sort of genres that weren't being explored in traditional fiction, at least certainly not in the West.
And this is where you've got those visual novels and...
but what we're talking about here is actual written novels. So I suppose we should talk about what I actually do, just as an introduction. So what I do is I release 5 chapters of a story, written word, every week. Local time, it's Tuesday to Saturday mornings, which sort of works out to Monday to Friday nights in the US, where most of my readership is. But
so just like with television, where people are watching a serialized, like The Boys, and they have to be patient each week as CBS or Netflix kind of dole out the next installment. Yeah. That's the structure you're in, and that would be standard within web serialized novels?
Yeah, all web serialized novels basically come out however often they come out, be that every single day of the week, Monday to Friday like me, or weekly, monthly, whatever it happens to be.
And people get very annoyed if they don't get released on time.
So yeah, that's right. There's the audience on the other side of this.
Yes.
In this environment of feedback, and I know you've got a Discord channel, and on these websites that you've posted this work, there are also comments, and so you'll get an immediate reaction to what your audience is wanting.
When I get something wrong, yeah. But
I'm releasing them at the moment, so it's more me getting something wrong.
But there's a lot of wariness in this genre because it's it's an amateur space.
So yeah, I guess if you wanted to get into it, one of the things to recognise is that it's a flooded market, it's a huge market, and the audience is really picky, right? I mean, it's a big international space, and because of the amount of material that's out there, audiences will really want to know that they're on a winner. They're on something which is going to stay the course of time.
Yeah, because people get very wary because it's an amateur space, so a lot of stories get started and then dropped. So the thing that people love more than anything else in these stories, more than anything else, is consistency. So if you reliably if you set a schedule and you keep it consistently, you will win and keep readers.
Because so far again, talking about the success of it, to define your own contribution into this space, you're quite successful now. You were saying off air that you've now secured an audiobook being made of the web serialization, as well as securing it to appear now as a kind of published ebook you can get through Amazon and more kind of conventional online book retailers would know.
Yeah, that'll be March. Yeah, late March.
I mean, readership and so forth. I mean, to recognise how, I guess, successful you've been, looking on the website, so for instance on Scribble Hub we've got 1.69 million views, 44,000 people have favorited it. We have 363 chapters. It says here 4 chapters a week, which is probably good if you can oversell that to 5. And then 2.5 readers, and that's just on Scribble Hub.
I think it's probably 2.5k readers rather than 2.5 people.
Sorry, 2.5k.
2.5.
Right.
Yeah.
Someone's really lazy.
No, but
then
actually, Scribble Hub is actually much smaller than Royal Road. Royal Road is sort of the central hub for Western sort of serialized fiction at the moment, like it or not. And a lot of people have problems with Royal Road.
So on Royal Road, so here are the stats for Royal Road. Overall, over 13 million views. So that's huge, right? That's put you at 4.5 stars. Does that mean a lot?
The 4.5 stars isn't about the views, that's about the ratings.
Right. So people have rated it really highly at an overall score of 4.5.
Yeah, at one point I was rated quite high, but my story in particular doesn't get a lot of middle-of-the-road reviews. I get a lot of people who enjoy it very much, and I get a lot of people who detest it with a passion.
So why is it so polarizing?
His main character, mostly.
Yeah, mostly the main character. My main character is a distinctive guy. He's arrogant. He's rash, which generally doesn't work out so poorly in this particular genre. But he also gets punished for being that quite a bit.
So do people dislike the character, or just because people would see a lot of themselves in a character like that?
A lot of people dislike. He's got what you might call social justice warrior tendencies.
Right. So
because a large part of his character is that he grew up in a Western society, relatively privileged, like. He wasn't super rich or anything, but he lives in Australia on the East Coast, big city, so he has a lot of you might call them left-leaning principles, socially progressive principles, and he brings those to a fantasy world where life is harder and meaner and
there really are monsters you need to kill, just flat out.
So he has
and this is one of the
ideas.
tensions with Game of Thrones, right? That the way women were treated in Game of Thrones got a lot of pushback in the later seasons because it was seen as really misogynistic and really out of step with the current temperament of progressive, hashtag Me Too society.
Yeah.
So here we have a character that is very progressive in a kind of But again, a lot of people like that non-progressiveness.
Yeah,
I mean, sadly,
but he's very and that's where a lot of the dislike comes from, because he doesn't like to shut up either. So he tends to go on great big screeds about whatever moral idea he happens to be up on his high horse about at any given moment. And quite often he's demonstrated to be just full of hot air. But people dislike when he goes on this very screed.
So by people, the readers.
Yes, there are people. There are whole reviews, quite lengthy ones, explaining why he's terrible for going on political rants, and because he's also an atheist up until chapter 46, where he meets a god, which pretty much puts an end to the atheism. But but a lot of it is more progressive political ideas, because he's actually literally an SJW cuck.
So, what does that mean?
A cuck. An SJW,
right.
social justice warrior. Social justice warrior cuck is, an SJW cuck is, something that people of a certain viewpoint view as one of the harsher criticisms they can levy at a person. And he is literally one.
So,
because,
and within this space, one of the things that I really enjoy about discussing your contribution to LitRPG is how you've been successful, and those are enormous views, and the Patreon's being incredibly successful. Yet, as you're talking about, there's a lot of hostility to your work in the community. There are some lovers of your work, but it's quite polarizing. So, what is an example of the type of typical LitRPG that you're kind of critiquing here, right? I mean, are there actually LitRPGs which are about guys going on adventures and into harem? I mean, I know in Japan, in Japanese anime, there are some harem adventures where it's all about...
Oh, God, yes.
There was a lot of talk of about harems and stuff early in the discussion, because people didn't know if it was going to be one.
And the harem
some
genre,
people love it, some people hate it.
So to define the harem genre, that is one of the really cliched and somewhat misogynistic kind of world-building genres, where the male character often goes into another world, or at least suddenly this worthless, this self-perceived worthless guy suddenly gets the attraction of a lot of women.
So with harem, typically there are a large number of non-mutually exclusive female love interests. You also do get reverse harem, where it's a girl who has a large number of non-mutually exclusive male love interests.
And I guess for me, like, I always think about those 1960s US series like Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie, where you have a very clever, talented female character married to a kind of drop-kick bloke, but it's very patriarchal, and the guy is the one that benefits mostly from episode to episode.
Well, a lot of it is a reaction to, we were talking about the origins in translated works from China. And from China specifically, they have cultivation novels. And my story sort of engages with a cultivation novel a lot. Cultivation novel is basically a form of fantasy. It's frequently based a lot in Taoism, with elements of like Buddhism, Confucianism.
So the main character is developing a spiritual pathway and becoming a magician?
It's sort of a... They tend to start sort of quite martial arty and then move into more of a very much a magician sort of thing. There's this idea of like defying the heavens as you grow in power and you meet certain thresholds and you go through sort of levels of reality. So you might start in a mortal world, and then you'll go up to what the mortal world thinks is heaven, and then you'll go up to what the heaven thinks is like super heaven.
And this is again telling the story of a main character who's
growing in power. They are cultivating their power.
And as they grow in power, they become increasingly attractive to all of the women.
No, they don't. They start that way.
Yeah, this is true. But
so they sound very much like classic Greek mythologies.
Yeah, but
right?
because these are thousands of chapters long, you'll get... he'll generally only have one or two women on the go at once. He'll quite frequently marry them and then like leave them behind because nobody is getting as strong as fast as he is. So in these cultivation novels, they'll often sort of raise through ranks and meet entirely new casts of characters as they go.
So has any of this become mainstream? Are there any examples of cultivation novels which have started to...
you can find quite a lot of them on Amazon. There's some quite big quite successful authors on Amazon that do similar things.
And translated ones. There's one, I think it's called Coiling Dragon.
Coiling Dragon.
It's one of the earlier ones. And that is actually I don't know how strictly cultivation that is. I haven't read in a while, but that's a Chinese author's take on Western fantasy, which is actually really fascinating.
So he's set it in a kind of J.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings world, or?
Yeah, but from a very sort of Chinese cultivation novel sensibility.
Right, well, you have, again, this character that becomes really overpowered.
Because what you'll generally have, and this is true for a lot of serialized fiction, be that cultivation or LitRPG, you'll generally have a main character who is relatively ordinary, and they'll get thrown into another world, or they'll find an object, but they'll have a cheat. What's called a cheat, which is basically the thing that lets them catch up to all the people who are sort of born into that kind of power.
Yeah, because we wouldn't live a day. I mean, as we were talking about with prime protagonists, like you take a guy that's worked part-time at Bunnings, or he sits behind a computer all day and suddenly finds himself in a fantasy world. We just don't have the stamina or resilience to survive long in those worlds.
The first guy with a knife is just going to kill you, because when's the last time you interacted with a knife that wasn't cooking?
Exactly, yeah, realistically. And again, that would destroy the fiction, right? I mean, you've got to get that suspension of disbelief hurdle overcome.
So in this instance, you tend to have a cheat, which is the mechanism by which you catch up. And that's something I was very conscious of. Because one of the problems in especially cultivation novels is that you get this cheat, and because you've got this cheat, you don't really earn. Like your protagonist doesn't really earn any of his accomplishments, but the world treats him as amazing for having these accomplishments, which gives you something of a disconnect from your character.
There's a phrase that's used in, I don't know what it's called, but it sums it up nicely, where the woman, Travis was telling me about this when he read this story after he stopped reading because it was just so misogynistic from this particular author. I don't want to put out that they're all misogynistic, but this guy was an amateur author and he wrote his power fantasy. And in it, one of the women says, "You are a dragon amongst men. I must marry you."
Yeah. So that's a real wish fulfillment fantasy.
Another big thing that I don't have in my story but appears in a lot of these novels is the idea of going back in time to do your life over again. So basically you'll have a character who life crapped all over, but then they get sent back in time and they get the chance to do everything, and their cheat is the fact that they know what's coming. So they get to sort of go from the start and use all the advantages and all that sort of thing. And in the, let's call them the less well-written ones, they'll meet all the women who rejected them along the way, and they'll get this sense of having missed an opportunity after they realise that this man is a dragon amongst men.
And these are the web novels. So again, what we're talking about here, for those people that I guess don't inhabit this space, what we're talking about here is an enormous web novel publication space. A lot of it's pretty much exclusively all amateur authors. Some of them, you know, the kind of 1% maybe start making their way up through that order and get filtered through ranking lists, so they become quite popular. But yeah, I mean, for the unwary, there's tons and tons of... I mean, I'm more familiar, I guess, with fan fiction, which has elements of this as well, where someone
quite
will
a few
write
of them
themselves.
started as fan fiction.
Right.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the contemporary space was sort of a meeting of sort of Western fan fiction and the sort of structures and concepts that came from these Asian translated stories.
And fan fiction...
Yeah, and they sort of met in the middle, and now you have these English language original stories that are huge and everywhere now.
So whereas fan fiction draws upon like it's set explicitly in the world of Harry Potter, but hey, there's a new character which bears a striking resemblance to the person that's writing it. I think that's a Mary Sue fanfic. Anyway,
Mary Sue is probably worth its own show.
Yeah.
Or they change they do a shipping fanfic where they relationship two characters,
Yeah.
either of the same gender or not, as a kind of wish fulfillment fantasy.
It's similar to doujinshi. I think that's
Right, the Japanese term doujinshi, yep.
But not everybody can can draw like that, and certainly not everybody can put drawings like that onto the web, whereas anybody from their phone these days can upload text. So if you write something set in the world that you love, that is fan fiction.
Well, a lot of
the next step being write something that is in a world that you create.
Okay, and that's how a lot of people get into this sort of space. They'll start with fan fiction, and they'll sort of then use that to sort of refine their craft.
And I think that makes a lot of sense to me, and some of the interviews and research I've read around it have pointed out that, look for a young teenage author or a young author or a new author or a first-time writer. If they're struggling writing a character from another gender's perspective, but they know what Hermione thinks through and through from Harry Potter because they've read the book so many times, then it makes sense writing a fanfic to develop that writing chop in terms of being able to write a believable female character because you know that character and its conventions there.
Use a previous scaffold to create a new construct.
Very much that scaffold idea. But you've gone in and developed your own world in itself, but drawing liberally across, I guess, in your way, the kind of fanish element of it I see is that kind of video game fan, right?
Yeah.
That you draw broadly from conventions of the video game world, and then conventions more narrowly within LitRPG that you're wanting to kind of poke in the ribs.
Yeah, so I explore a lot of those ideas. Like very early on, when people weren't sure if my story was going to be a harem, every time a new female character pops up, there's discussion: is this character going in the harem? That eventually dropped off.
Because would you say, who would be the main demographic of reader for your work? Is there any
young males?
That would be the cliche as well. And would that be the reality?
I would guess young men, but that would actually be a guess.
Because there's no...
I don't have any demographic stats.
On the other hand, I read quite a few of them. I'm not a young man. I'm young at heart. There we go. There would be... Let's put it this way. There's people who have the ability to pay him every month in order to continue reading chapters in advance of the releases. So obviously these people are job age. There's not just a whole bunch of casually independently wealthy children reading this stuff. So they must be working age at least.
That being said, because all my chapters go up for free. And people pay me to get access to chapters a month, also early.
Yes, so I do want to talk about the mechanics of the, how this is a sustainable economy for someone to enter into. And obviously the problem with any cultural work is that the success ratio to failure ratio is so out of whack, right? There's a 1% success to a 99% failure, as in everything from Hollywood down, or maybe up, depending upon your point of view with Hollywood's value. So within this space, though, it is, and it's great having you on because you do provide that example of someone who has been able to wrestle and secure well-deserved success in a huge flooded market. And I would like to talk a bit about how that Patreon space has been able to open that up. But we might take a break. We've just been laying the groundwork, I guess. We've got most of the terms done. There was one other term, maybe before we go to a song, I quickly want to define, because it's the one which dominates my head when I think of LitRPG, which is Isekai, which is...
basically portal fantasy. That's...
The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Yeah. Mark Twain did a portal fantasy.
So it's literally, the Alice in Wonderland, you go through literally a portal that goes from one world to another world.
John Carter was
right,
one.
Yes.
But,
Edgar Rice Burroughs?
Yeah,
I think so.
Isekai is a Japanese term, obviously, and that's where the popularity of it has exploded massively over the last... decade and a half now, I guess. And
it's pretty much supplanted in terms of this these platforms, for Scribble Hub and Royal Road. The Japanese term is the one that's deferred to often to locate the work as this story will involve someone going through a magical portal or some portal to another world.
Yeah.
Isekai. Yeah, okay, great. So what we'll do is we'll play a quick song and come back and talk about the mechanics of success, the top 5 tips for all the boys and girls out there if they would also like to one day write their own self-sustaining lit RPG to live off of. Alrighty. Hey, that was Nat Vaser with Better Now. Gee, I really hit that R. That's why a lot of people think I'm from America, which I'm not. But I hit R's strongly. Maybe that could be my new name, the R hitter.
It's just a pity there's no R in PhD then.
I'm Craig Norris, PhD, and this is Media Tackle. I'm joined by Travis and Peter talking about the world of self-publishing, writing in webs, novels, web novel writing for web novels, and how to make that sustainable. One of the things that's really interesting as we hear the sounds of the internet around us is that you've been able to break through, Travis. I mean, how did you know you'd broken through? What was the point you realized, okay, what I've set up has actually managed to work?
Well, obviously, ideally you want to be able to sustain yourself with what you do.
Closer to Mike. These are words of gold.
Okay, so you want to be able to sustain yourself with what you do, and most people who work in my area, because you can publish traditional fiction, go to a publisher, they'll make a book and they'll sell it and give you money. Then there's self-publication, which is becoming an increasingly viable field.
Because there's nothing to stop someone just going on, putting something up Amazon today.
Yeah, that's very straightforward. That's sort of the other end. And in the middle is people who sort of professionally self-publish. I'm sort of way down, even past the Amazon chain. You get to people who just post things online on websites specifically for posting stories online.
And these spaces are really great in terms of providing feedback to new authors, supportive, and quote mark, communities, which will hopefully nurture. So yeah, there's a lot of fanfic.
Well, because they have sort of these established communities, and there are people out there who are looking for new stories, and they'll recommend them in forums and that sort of thing, and that's one of the way people find it. One of the things that really helped me, because with a website called Royal Road, there's tens of thousands of stories. There's people creating new stories every single day, and they're constantly making new chapters, and they're going up and they're going up. If you can get yourself onto the front page of Royal Road, you will have a real explosion of readership. So after you've been uploading a story consistently for a month, you then qualify to get on that trending page. So if it finds your stats are going well, they'll plonk you on the trending page. That tends to get you a huge boost. And they have popularity lists. They have the top rated stories list. I think I got to number 3 on there at one point. There's the most popular list. I've been on there most of the time. And this is because, and when the trending list came around, I started at the top of it because I got a jump start. Because one of the things you have is people who do a lot of reviewing. They find new things and they review it, put it out, their reviews out there for people to find and read. And one of the lists there is the top reviews. And so for a very long time, the top rated review on the website was of my story.
Wow.
So even though it was the review that got the attention, the fact that it was for my story drew in lots and lots and lots of new audience members, especially given that it was a positive review.
And it was a case of stepwise exposure. He was on the new release page. Then the person reviewed him, and the review was up after he dropped off the new release page. Then by the time that review dropped off, he was on the trending page. And then by the time the trending page dropped off, he was in the top 3, which is the front page of that website. So for weeks and weeks, he was on the front page. That did really well for me. So, because one of the mistakes people make is the way people get paid is through Patreon. For anyone not familiar, Patreon is a place where people doing creative work on the internet can be
paid for their trouble by their audience.
And it could be as little as, like, I think yours is just $1.
$1 a month is the minimum thing.
And then you can have different, like there's a $1 one, a $5 one, and a $10 one, which gives you different access.
So the traditional model with stories is the various tiers of support will get access to different levels of advanced chapters. So for $10 a month, you get access to all my chapters a month ahead. But the vast majority of my readers don't pay anything. They just go to Royal Road and read it for free.
Even though that content is a month behind what will be released.
Because I get an average of 25,000, 30,000 readers per chapter.
25 to 30,000.
Something like that. And,
that's good.
But there's only, 2,000 something people actually financially supporting me. And that's fine. That's how it works. I'm very comfortable where I'm sitting right now. But one of the mistakes people make is they will drop like 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters of the story, and there's their Patreon. And it doesn't inspire confidence in readers because they want consistency. Consistency is key. If you're reliable, you will get and you'll keep readers, provided your story is actually good enough. Because if you're reliable and you're really, really bad at English,
because by the time I guess you'd got those reviews and were on the front page, you've got quite a bit of content under your belt that's online.
Yeah. So preparation, and I tell this to everyone who asks me because I get some people who want to do this professionally, and I always say preparation. I had lots of chapters ready beforehand. I release
by a lot of chapters.
I had 75.
Is that what you'd say? That's a lot.
Well, it depends. I would have liked to have had more.
And by that, a chapter is about 1,000, 2,000 words?
2.5 to 3,000. It started off somewhere around the 2,000 mark. I think my average is now about 2,700 per chapter. But I had these 75 chapters, and I started off. I normally release 5 chapters a week, but that first week I released 15 chapters. 3 every day. The next week it was 2 every day, and then the third week it was moved into my normal release schedule. And so I had 3 weeks, 30 chapters up, and that gave people a confidence in what was going to happen. Because I didn't just sort of blindly amble into this either. I did a lot of research in how to be successful at this sort of thing because I wanted to make a career out of this.
So you become very familiar with the web portals themselves, the Royal Road.
Yeah, so I familiarised myself with the various formats, the places I wanted to upload, because there is stuff out there from people sort of explaining things that'll help you find success. And I found the ones that worked for me, the ones that didn't. I also massively underestimated how much work it would be, not just the writing, but the sort of the things about the writing, the posting and the formatting of chapters and all that sort of thing, which is why I now have a writer's assistant to help me do all that stuff, and by which I mean have him do all that stuff.
But yeah, you can't underestimate the fact that getting this stuff out and read isn't just having a good story, it's also being able to punctuate and to format, because it does make it so much more readable.
Oh yeah, revision is very important, but preparation is key. So that it came down to research, it came down to having chapters in the back. Because once I had my 30 chapters out in 3 weeks, then that was about the point I started getting... I'd built up an audience by that point because the review had gone out and I had this sort of explosion thing. One of the things I had to learn was sort of community engagement, engaging people within the comments. I wasn't particularly good at it to start with.
So how did you do that? You just tried to reply to as many as you could? Thanks for the comment?
Yeah, as it seemed appropriate, because I didn't want to just make facetious, thank you for the thing. I tried to engage with readers, because an engaged community is a community that keeps coming back.
When he stopped writing, when he was writing, and I'd go into his room and he'd just I've written 500 words, I need a break. One of the things he'd do is he'd go on to the Royal Road comments and find out what people were thinking about the previous chapter and maybe respond once or twice. And so it created a very organic feedback loop. They didn't know when he'd be on, but he would be on during the day.
Yeah, and now I've sort of translated it to the Discord, which is something I was a bit reluctant about because I'm not a big social media engager.
So Discord is a very large kind of hub of communication, chat.
Yeah, and you can basically set up your own server to serve your own community. So I have my Discord server where readers can come in, and there's different channels. Like there's one for the people who are just reading the free chapters, so there's not allowed to be any spoilers in that one. And then there's for the advanced chapters, and then there's like some special channels for people who pay me way too much money.
And within that there are moderators.
And they get to, so they get to ask me questions that I will like. People ask me questions a lot, and I try and engage. But I've also got this channel for the people who pay me way too much money, and I'll always answer their questions. But
because some of the questions must be very finicky.
Oh yeah, because a very large part of what people like about my story is the sort of magic system, which is non-traditional compared to a lot of LitRPGs, and there's a lot of sophistication to it. And people have really engaged with that in a big way. So they ask like lots of questions. What happens with this and this and this, and so I a couple of times a week I'll try and sort of take a question someone asked and do sort of a deep dive into that sort of little specific corner of the system.
And you'll put that up on the Discord page?
I'll put that up on the Discord for people to read.
So it's a real, again, that idea of Transmedia by Henry Jenkins. Where some of the world building's going on off Mothership, right? So the Mothership is very much your published weekly novel, but for those fans that want more, they go to Discord, and from the author himself, they'll get...
Yeah, and Discord is that place where I explore corners of the world building that won't make it into the text. So.
And as he said, preparation is key because he has that. He has a Bible. When somebody asks a question with like, what does this essence do in this situation with this spell, presuming it's Tuesday?
Yeah, because you don't want to come across...
He's got that answer.
Yeah.
Usually the answer is same as every other day, but he will have an answer.
And sometimes do you have to bluff? I mean, well, I shouldn't ask that. That's very cruel. But it is difficult, isn't it, to...
Well, I mean, it's not bluffing. It's someone will ask a question that I haven't considered. And because it's not like a live chat situation exactly, I mean, it can be, but because it's not a live chat situation, that gives you time to go, I've never considered that. So I sit down and I work it out and I add it to my notes, and then I can just sort of put it out there for people to look at.
Which is the most fruitful part of having an audience.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. But
and occasionally he makes slight errors, like the duck essence.
What? Oh, yeah, because the core of my system is those sort of thematic sets of abilities that people get. And I made an offhand comment about someone having duck powers. And the community latched onto that a lot more than I ever actually anticipated. So ultimately that did make its way into... I did a series of side stories when I was on a break between volumes 1 and 2. I did a series of side stories, and one was a flashback to this sort of legendary elven hunter with duck powers. I think his name was like Brian.
Brian, son of Keith.
Yeah.
Well, okay, if we can, as we're wrapping up towards the top of the hour, one last tip. Is there anything in particular you'd like to leave our audience with? Last tip, the last word of advice?
No, well, what I was talking about earlier, preparation. If this is something you want to get into, don't come into it lightly. Like I was explaining earlier how I did that audience build up, and it was only once people started asking if I was going to put up a Patreon that I actually launched my Patreon, because there's an expectation of advanced chapters coming from tiers. So people was like, well, because I started off with lots of chapters and then slowly slowed that down to my normal rate, at which point people are like, I want another great big lot of chapters. So, and this is another reason preparation is important, because when my Patreon launched, it was 20 chapters. Like,
right, that they got. That's a great incentive.
Yeah, so immediately they can like jump ahead 20 chapters. And
then you did the stretch goals.
oh yeah, I had some goals because I had no expectation of it being super successful. I was hoping I'd get enough to live on, so I set sort of some modest goals. One was like, okay, if I get this much, that's about half of what I need to sort of live on. And then the other stretch goal is like, I can live on that much money. And I was hoping in a couple of months I'd sort of get to that point of self-sustaining. It took a day and a half. And each goal came with a promise of more double chapter weeks.
Wow.
So all of the chapters I'd built up, away they went. So I started off that first month, I was very, very tired. I was working 18-hour days to make sure everything was edited and formatted, because I was still learning so many things and sort of learning community engagement, and I still had to keep pumping out more chapters so that once all of those chapters I had ready were done, I had more chapters to release.
Well, sobering words to end on. Peter?
If I was going to give my outside perspective as the last one, have friends, people you can rely on, because I'm the assistant now. But since day one, in fact, since the previous iteration of this story, I've been basically his line editor. Because I love the story, I want to read it, and the guy who writes it's next door. So it's in the next room. So I say, give me the chapter. Yeah. And he does. And then I read it. And I see where the things where he's misedited because he's cutting and pasting, or missed out a word, or write thee instead of they. And I'll point that out to him, and it'll go out. And that makes the story easier to read and better. He's got an entire other guy he posts it to first, who gives him sort of content editing. So having people you can show your work, not working in a vacuum.
And you want to give it to people you'll trust to tell you what's wrong, not who will, tell you that it's great. But I guess if there was one thing I was going to say, if you want to do this as a job, treat it as a job. If you try and sort of half measure it, sort of dabble, it can be a fantastic hobby. But if you want to do it as a job and be successful, you have to treat it like one.
Travis, Peter, thank you so much for joining us this week on Media Tackle. A lot of fun, really, really informative, and might get you back on in the future to hear how it's all going since now.
Look forward to it.
Thanks very much. Keep listening to Edge Radio. We've got news and journalism coming up next.